Secret of the Andes by Anne Nolan Clark. Chapter 5. The Steep Trail. Kusi needed no one to waken him. He had been awake long before Chudo motioned him to follow along as the old one walked yesterday's trail to the place of the sunrise call. The way did not seem as long this morning as it had the day before, or as difficult, or as dark. Kusi kept within touching distance of Chudo's swiftly moving shadow, slipping through the dawn. The boy was pleased that the trail was easier to follow. Just once walking over it, and I know it well, he thought. My feet learn quickly. Or maybe it's these new sandals Chudo made yesterday. Maybe some of the minstrel's music went into the making. The boy chuckled at the thought. But as Chudo turned his head to listen, Kusi stopped his laughter. Perhaps this was not the time for letting thoughts go straying. Perhaps he should be thinking of the great Sun Father. Kusi shivered. This morning the wind was very cold. It was filled with the chill breath of the snowbanks. It was not a day wind, loud and lusty. It was a dawn wind of the high Sierras, low and slow and cold. Only the sun could warm the world and make it right for living. The man and the boy had now reached the rock circle and stood waiting, facing the eastern sky. Slowly the sky colored, heralding the coming day. Slowly Kusi felt happiness fill his body warmly. This had never happened to him before. Never before had he felt happiness flowing with his blood to make his body warm and light with captured laughter and delight. Then the sun came. Chudo's voice rose to meet the sun, and Kusi knew forever the joy of welcoming the coming of the great Father who lightened and warmed the world. After the call was finished, Chudo stood for a minute with head bowed, lost in thinking. For a brief time he had touched the spirit world, and he hated to return to the realness of living. But it was only for a moment. With a sigh, the old man raised his head, straightened his thin shoulders, and turned to the homeward trail. The way back was even more swift than the coming had been. Chudo was troubled. Kusi felt it, and he knew what was troubling the old one. He does not want to leave our llamas. He does not want to see the outside world, the boy thought, and felt guilt at his own excitement in going. Breakfast was quiet. The minstrel sat deep in thought. His face was closed this morning. No flashing smile came to lighten its darkness and to soften its sternness. More than ever, he bore the look of an eagle, ready for flight. His songs had stilled themselves. His pipes lay silent on the ichu grass. Only his body was with them. His mind and his heart were traveling another trail. Sanka whined, and the day wind began blowing. Misty kept close beside his young master. Chudo ate, looking only at the food set before them. Kusi would have liked to talk. He needed to talk. Going to the salt pits was an event that needed to be talked about. But the boy did not talk. The silence of the two men was too heavy to cut through with words. The breakfast corn and potatoes eaten, Chudo began to pack. The minstrel stirred and looked around. Then he spoke. Perhaps I know more than my songs, he said. Perhaps I, too, have been sent along the path I follow. Are you certain, brother, that you want this salt you journey to get? Are you sure it is what you want to do? Chudo nodded, but did not speak or stop his work of getting the possessions together. After a time, the minstrel spoke again. Hidden Valley takes care of its flock and the keepers of its flock. Not so the world outside. The outside world is filled with people who are strange to you. They are people of two bloods. They are and they are not. They know and they do not know. They care and they do not care. Think, brother, are you certain that you want to ford this river of people whose blood runs fresh and salt in never mixing streams? Chudo answered simply, I do not want to go. There is no need to go. It has been asked of me. Once I received a like request and I refused it. The cost of that refusal lies heavy in my heart. To this the minstrel had no answer. Instead, he went into the hut and brought out his pack. This, he said, handing Chudo a small package, is food fit for a journey. It is brown sugar and parched corn. Eat it as you walk along, and your feet will not stumble because of hunger. Chudo was pleased. He took the package offered him. I know this food. I carried it always when I too journeyed over the mountain trails. Kusi had been whispering to Misty, but now he looked at Chudo in surprise. He had not known that Chudo had traveled the mountain trails. He had never thought about it really, but if he had, he would have thought that Chudo always had lived in Hidden Valley. He felt a flash of jealousy that Chudo had known another world than this they shared together. He must know more about it, all about it. Where had Chudo been? The boy began a question, but the minstrel stopped him. Look how pleased Misty is that you are going to see the world beyond the swinging bridge, he said jokingly. Kusi's eyes danced with delight. Are we going by the narrow trail? Are we going over the swinging bridge? Is it possible? He asked. His words tumbled over themselves in his excitement. Chudo nodded and the minstrel laughed. Why not? It is the shortest way down the mountain, especially if you should fall. He was teasing now. Kusi laughed with him. Chudo counted the bundles aloud. These two rolled mats for sleeping. I take one for Kusi. Inside them, so, I put the squares of woven cloth for the salt, the coils of rope to tie them, 2 for me and 1 for Kusi. The gift package of food I will divide. We will need to eat it as we walk along. The extra sandals and the ponchos I will take. The gourds for drinking I tie here to this. The spun yarn for trading goes in Kusi's pack, all except that which we spin as we walk along. It's all here, I think. Yes, it's all here. Chudo stood up and looked around with satisfaction. It was good to know that everything that was needed was in its place, ready for the taking. Quickly, he rolled the mats. The smaller one was Kusi's. He tied it across the boy's shoulders. The larger one he took upon his own back. Then he tied his cocoa bag full of dried coca leaves and lime lumps made of seashell to the sash at his side where his poncho opened. The small cocoa bag he gave to Kusi, who tied it to his own sash. Then the old one looped his slingshot over his shoulder. It was his only weapon. He was not a hunter. He was a shepherd. The slingshot was all he needed. They were ready to go. Everything was ready. There was nothing more to do. They said goodbye. Misty looked after them. His sharp pointed ears with the red wooden tassels stood straight up in surprise. Could it be that he was being left behind? Quietly and deliberately, he spat. At nothing in particular, just to show his displeasure. It made him feel better. Sunka whined. It was the only thing he could do. It did not make him feel better. He whined too much and too often. Chuto and Kusi had begun their journey. They walked across the meadow of ichu grass, a thin old man and a thinner, younger boy. They were dressed alike, knitted woolen caps of bright llama yarn on their heads, blue ponchos with red embroidered stripes of woven of llama wool on their shoulders, white shin-length cotton trousers, and tied llama sandals. Their rolled mat bundles moved as their shoulders moved. They did not look back. They had begun their journey. They were on their way. They passed the opening of the llama trail down into the valley where the Indian family were clearing the underbrush for their new home. In a way, Kusi would have liked to take this trail. If they had done so, they could have seen the family close by. He could, perhaps, have talked with them. Then he would have known so much more about them than he possibly could learn just by watching. Also, if they had gone by way of the llama trail, he could have taken Misty. Since Misty had been old enough to leave his mother, Yellow Ears, he had been the boy's companion by day and by night. Kusi felt strange to be going off without the beautiful black llama walking proudly beside him. But quickly the young Indian boy forgot Misty in his excitement over the trail they were taking. This trail lay behind the ruins of the stone corral, behind the grass-thatched hut, behind the mountain meadow where the llamas grazed. It was hidden from view by a clump of trees, hung heavily with vines and covered thickly with green, velvety moss and white feathered lichens. Kusi knew about this trail, but he had never traveled it before. At once it led steeply 100 feet downward to the knife-like edge of a sheer rock cliff. 2,000 feet below them tumbled and stormed the roaring rapids of a wide, swiftly moving river. The deep thunder roar of the rapids could be heard distinctly on the cliff crest where Chuto and Kusi stood. Beneath them, white spray shot upward like a lacy veil, partly hiding the dark green water of the river and giant tree trunks that were being tossed and splintered against sharp boulders in the mighty current. The boy lifted his eyes from the wild, angry scene below him and let them travel to the opposite cliff that loomed just as sharply and just as sheer on the far side of the wide, wide river. Over the gorge, above the rapids, connecting cliff to cliff, swung a slender bridge. This was the swinging bridge the minstrel had teased about. This was the bridge they must cross. The bridge was made of rope vines of magui plant. These vines had been twisted and plaited together into two cables as thick as Chuto's body. They were tied into holes that had been drilled in the cliff walls. Between the rope cable planks had been tied. Higher up was a smaller vine rope to be used as a handrail. Kusi had looked at this swinging bridge before, but he had never thought of crossing it. Now terror touched him with its cold fingers, and hot excitement filled him with the thought of what he was about to do. He felt that he could never move a sandaled foot a half pace forward. Yet he knew that he would move. He knew that he would cross the bridge. He knew that nothing could hinder that first step that would lead forward. Chudo looked at the boy once, briefly, then stepped upon the first plank. Kusi watched him. He was terrified. He was fascinated. He was at once impatient and yet frightened for his own starting. Step by step, hand by hand, the old man crossed the canyon. The frail-looking bridge swayed and swung. Far below, the rapids leaped up in icy frenzy. Chudo became but a small speck moving along the rocking vine cable. Slowly, 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 he moved farther along. He reached the middle, and the bridge dipped hammock-like. Kusi never took his eyes from the black dot on the slender line. Breathlessly, he watched. He waited. He watched. Ah! Chudo had reached the far cliff ledge. He stood there, gaining his balance on the firm rock cliff. Then he turned, raising a hand as signal for Kusi's starting. Not for nothing had Chudo trained the boy to obey his commands. This was reward for his years of patient teaching. Kusi put one foot on the first plank and moved his body forward. He was on the bridge now. He must keep going. Move a foot and move a hand. Inch forward. Never look backward. Never look downward. Never look anywhere but the opposite cliff where good, kind Chudo waited. Suddenly, Kusi was not afraid. He felt bold and brave and strong and tall. This was adventure. This was fun. He was at the middle now. The bridge was not dipping as much as it had done when Chudo crossed. It was swinging. It was swaying. It was rocking, but it was not dipping. Keep going. Keep going. Step by step. Hand by hand. Never look down. Keep looking at Chudo. He was bigger now. Chudo was bigger. He could see him plainly. He was his everyday size. The bridge stopped moving underfoot. Kusi had reached the firm rock ledge. He had reached the other side. The world danced crazily around him, around and around. Dizzily, he leaned forward. He shut his eyes to clear his dizziness. Chudo said mildly, "A few coca leaves can be chewed now, I think. Yes, we will sit here with our backs against the cliff wall and chew some coca leaves." Kusi was glad to sit down. He did not look again at the bridge across the chasm. He did not need to see it. He had crossed it. That was enough. Far below, the rapids sprayed and foamed. The dark green river flowed its way through the heart of a mountain made of granite. A condor soared and swerved and circled in graceful, lazy curves against the tropic sky. White clouds tore themselves on the jagged, crested mountains and hung in gray wisps upon the pointed peaks of deeper whiter, glistening snow. Chuto stood up, stretched himself, and motioned with his lips that this was the way that they would go. The cliff where they were was a rounded pillar of granite. There was no trail up its smooth, hard sides. There was no trail down. Kusi watched Chuto as the Indian swung upward, catching the end of a narrow ladder made of tied tree branches. Then he boosted Kusi up so that the boy could catch the ladder ends, could hold them tightly in his hands, could get a foothold on the ladder. Kusi began climbing. He had to climb. He could not get down. There was only space beneath him. The granite rock was in layers of color, beautiful colors, rich and dark and aged with weather and with years. Kusi dared not look up or down or sideways. There was no Chuto to watch, for the old man had been left far below him. Across the cliff face, the boy climbed steadily. Sweat ran into his eyes, stinging them with its salt. His hands were wet against the ladder rungs, but he climbed on and on. At last he reached safety behind the granite wall. The mountain here sloped gently into a lush green valley. Vines and ferns, bushes and flowers and orchid plants made a world more beautiful than a dream. There was no ichu grass or bare brown hills. Only by looking far, far above in the blue painted sky could he see the pointed peaks of snow. Below him in the valley, a gentle rain was falling. The wetness of the raindrops made the greenness of the jungle fresher, greener, and more vivid. Hidden Valley lies behind us. Kusi turned at the sound. Chuto was jumping lightly from the top of the ladder to the sloping trail.